Everyone, my name is Lindsay and you are watching Lindsay Adventure, and today we are adventuring through another Bible story just like we do every single Friday. So today I'd like to share with you a few little thoughts that I've been kind of gathering along the way, and I've got a little poem to read to you. I'll probably read that a little bit later, and also I basically have some reflections on the story of Judah. Now, I'll give you a little bit of backstory before we read the story, and I'll kind of keep, I think, explaining as we read. So, Judah was the fourth son of Jacob. Now, we know from Genesis that, God blessed Abraham, and then Abraham passed on this blessing that, would bless the nations. Basically, Jesus would come through his lineage and would die on the cross and save the whole world of our sins. So this blessing came through from Abraham. It went down to Isaac, his son, and to Jacob, his son. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, and so he had to decide which one was going to be his heir. It was usually the firstborn, and who would, therefore also carry on this blessing through their lineage that would bless the nations that Jesus would come through. And so, unfortunately, Jacob was a bit of a rough kid himself. He snuck out the blessing and the birthright from his own brother, another story entirely, and then he had to run off and basically live in exile from his family for a large portion of his life. He married Rachel and Leah and had a whole bunch of kids amongst them and their servants. And then we see that Jacob had favoritism for Joseph, which we've discussed in another video. But here I'd like to talk about a different one of Jacob's son, which is Judah. So, like I said a moment ago, I think I said it, that Judah was Jacob's fourth son. He wasn't the first one. He wasn't, immediately in line to be the heir of the family fortune and for the blessing. But because of a whole bunch of dumb stuff, very, very evil stuff actually, that his three elder brothers did. One of them slept with one of Jacob's wives, one of the maids that had like a whole bunch of the sons. He slept with her, and obviously that breaks a lot of trust and is just diabolical. Like, how could you do that to your own father? Sleep with basically your stepmom. That's disgusting. So he was not in Jacob's good books anymore. That was Reuben. And then Simeon and Levi, they had their own problems because they had a sister, so Dinah. There was the 12 brothers, and then we know of one sister called Dinah. I have something in my eye. It's been here for 3 days, and it's really annoying me. So I'm going to blink a lot. So Dinah, she went off and hung out with her Canaanite friends, and she ended up catching the eye of the local prince, and these two brothers of hers were very offended at the fact that he slept with her, and now he wants to marry her because, he's besotted and entirely in love with Dinah, and he'll do anything he can to, marry her now. But because these two older brothers were so infuriated, they didn't even tell Jacob what had happened. They just went and were sneaky and basically ended up massacring the entire town. Like, they committed genocide on an entire town because they were just offended with the guy in charge for sleeping with their sister. And so because of that, obviously they were just out of the good books too. Jacob is, horrified they would do this, and because of this happening, they have to get up and leave before, the other local towns decide they're going to avenge their honor, basically, and go and kill off this family of Jacob's. So they have to leave, and in the process, Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife, is just about to give birth to Benjamin. She gives birth to him while they're leaving, and she ends up dying because of all the stress of the situation. And so these two brothers, Simeon and Levi, are just nowhere near favorites of Jacob at this point. And so we come down to Judah. Judah is the fourth born, and he hasn't done anything wrong at this point. And he is like the next in line for being the heir of the family and carrying on this blessing. Now, we come to the point in the story where Joseph starts being a bit of a brat and having these dreams, think he's wonderful and that all of his family is going to have to bow down to him one day, which sure, God gave him these dreams, but he didn't have to be a brat about it. And he was dobbing on his brothers for, you know, doing the wrong thing or doing things that he didn't think was the best idea. And so they're all just sick of Joseph. They're sick of the favoritism. They're sick of all of this stuff. And they want to kill him. And they very nearly do it. And then Judah actually says, oh, how about instead of killing Joseph, let's just enslave him and send him packing off to Egypt with these traders. And so they follow his advice. They look up to him. His brothers see him as a leader at this point, and the responsibility of enslaving Joseph and basically sending him off to what they thought would be his death, because slaves don't live very long, and certainly not in Egypt. Yeah, they would have had these guilty consciences following them around. Not at first, like they would have been like, oh, we're rid of our pest. But because Judah kind of led in that situation, it's really his responsibility more than anyone else's that this is what's happened now. So they go back and Jacob finds out that, well, they tell him that they found Joseph's fancy coat and it's all torn and it looks like some sort of animal has ripped him apart and eaten him. Never to be seen again. And so Jacob is wailing and crying and refuses to be comforted by anyone. It says he'll go to his grave, you know, mourning his son. And so at first the brothers would have been just like annoyed, like, we got rid of like this brother, but now dad's like crying. But as time goes on and Jacob keeps crying and like refuses to find any joy in life anymore, there would have been like a range of emotions that they would have gone through, and Judah more than anyone else, because ultimately it came down to his decision that everyone else just agreed with. And so we come to this point in Genesis chapter 38. We'll pick it up here. Let me have a drink of water because I don't want to be coughing anymore. Okay. So let me read. So Genesis chapter 38. It came to pass that at that time that Judah departed from his brothers, and he visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. So he's got this mate from Adullam whose name is Hira. He's clearly not one of their family. He's a local Canaanite guy, and generally that spells trouble. So because of his association with Hira, Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. So the guy was Shua, and he married Shua's daughter, and he went into her. So she conceived, and she bore one son, and he called him She conceived again, she bore another son, and she called him Onan. And she conceived again, and bore a son, and called his name Shelah. So Judah was at Chezib when she bore the third son. So he was out of town. He wasn't even a great dad, so he just didn't even care that his third son was being born. He was just somewhere else at this point. So Judah's already started off on a pretty rocky sort of direction by marrying one of the local Canaanite women. If you look at the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they all marry close relatives back from the homeland, back in Haran. And they, you know, Abraham refuses to let his servant get a local Canaanite woman. You can go and check out my first video about Isaac and Rebecca and see how that all happened. But basically, yeah, he's like, no, you have to get one of my family, somebody who, you know, at least loosely believes in the same God to some degree, has the same kind of values, same kind of culture. We don't want to be marrying into one of these Canaanite families because they're very corrupted. They have very, very bad, corrupted religion, which eventually God would, you know, deal with by bringing the Israelites to kind of knock them out. But basically, yeah, so Judah goes against the family tradition of finding a wife from one of his relatives, one of the people who have the same kind of religion as him. And he doesn't care about that. He's sick of everything. His brothers are kind of crazy and he's now got a very, very guilty conscience. And so he gets himself this local Canaanite wife and she has 3 sons. And Judah's firstborn, so we pick it up in verse 7, he was wicked in the sight of the Lord and the Lord killed him. So he did a lot of bad stuff and God was like, nope, not having that, see ya. And Judah said to Onan, the second-born, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. Now, we've discussed this in the video on Ruth and Boaz about levirate marriage. So basically, if a man and a woman get married and the man dies before they end up having any kids, especially sons, then God put in his law this part where you're supposed to have the woman marry one of her husband's close male relatives, and the son that they would produce out of that union would not be considered the second guy's son. It would be considered the first guy's son. It would be there like as a representative, because they have this close like biological genetic sort of similarity. Then it would be considered the original husband's child, and then any other further children would be the second guy's. And so the name would be preserved for eternity, like they would keep having more and more generations for that first man. And it would kind of like, it was kind of like considered an afterlife. Like if you have children and they have children and you remember your lineage, that's why we see lots of, you know, long winded lineages throughout the Bible. Like this guy had this son and he had this son and this son and this son. And you kind of just know where you come from. And you also, when you say that name is remembered and therefore it's somehow alive in some way. So their afterlife idea was, if somebody says my name, then in some way I am living on, at least in memory. So that's why they would have this idea to have levirate marriage. And it looks like God is very much for this. He put it in the law, and before he even put it in law, they already kind of knew that this was a good idea, because this story is taking place before Moses and before God gave Moses all those laws. So let me have a breath. I need to breathe. Okay. So Onan, verse 9, Onan knew that the heir would not be his when he would marry this woman, Tamar. So when he went into his brother's wife, he admitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. So he pulled out and his seed went where it was not supposed to go. And there was no opportunity for Tamar to conceive in that. And in verse 10, it says, and the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore God killed him also. So God killed the first son for just being wicked in general. And then God killed the second son because he did this one very specific thing that was just like super against God's values of like, you know, raising up a name for the first guy who wasn't a great guy in the first place. But, you know, you got to do these things. You can't just set these bad examples. You can't just get away with this kind of stuff with God. So God kills both these 2 sons. And then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house. So go back to your dad's house till my son Shelah is grown. So Shelah is very likely to be so much younger that he hasn't even hit puberty yet. Because at that point, you know, as soon as you're old enough to be making babies, then you can get married basically in these days. Yeah, so he said, he said to himself, basically, Judah's thinking, I don't want Shelah to die like his brothers do, so I'm going to send Tamar packing off to her father's house, telling her that, oh, I'll call you when Shelah is old enough to give you a child. But he never really intended to do so, because he somehow thought that because Tamar was involved with both of his sons, that was the reason why they died. Not because they did the wrong thing or anything, but because this Canaanite woman was obviously cursed, and I don't want her to be anywhere near my only remaining son, and for him to die as well. So he's a bit scared of her at this point, a bit paranoid. Now, in the process of time, which when we read that phrase in the Bible, in the process of time, it means many years. It's not just like a few months or a year, it's like plural, many years. Okay, so many years have gone past, and the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. So Judah's wife is dead, and he doesn't have a wife at this point. And Judah was comforted, so he went through his mourning period of usually like a week or two, or a month maybe. So he cried for a little bit, and Judah was comforted, and he went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, and he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So we've got his mate Hira, who kind of spelt trouble in the start of the chapter, and now he's hanging out with him again. And it was told to Tamar at this point, saying, "Look, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep." So I remember hearing somebody tell this story before, and they said, "Oh, I have an itchy nose. Oh, my eye's itchy, my nose is itchy." Back in those days, they wouldn't get like a weekly or fortnightly or a monthly kind of wage, and they didn't even have like cash money. They would trade things with different items. They would trade like grain for some sheep or something like that. They basically bartered goods. They didn't actually have a money, like a cash kind of currency, that kind of economy back in those days. That came a few hundred years later, if not 1,000 years later. And so, why am I saying this? Oh yeah, so because he's going off to shear his sheep, when the sheep are shorn, it's a tongue twister almost, they would have the wool. And so they've been growing this wool on these sheep for a year, and they've been getting no income from these sheep for this whole past year. But now that they have all of this wool that's shorn, they can go and party. They can, live it up, basically. And at this point, Judah's not married anymore. And honestly, he's probably the kind of guy who wouldn't really care if he was, to be honest. So he's now flushed with cash, not literally, but he's got a lot of income all of a sudden. And he's willing to have a party. And so now that he's by himself, he sees this prostitute, because it says in verse 14, she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. So she figured out over time, over the many years that have passed, that Judah wasn't going to keep his word. Shelah was definitely old enough, and had been old enough for a while, for her to get a child by him, and she'd been forgotten about in the process. And so she decided, rightfully so, in fact, that she was going to take matters into her own hands. She had a right to have a child by a close relative of her husband, and no close relative had been provided for her. And so it was now, the ball was basically in her court, and she took it, and she did what she wanted. So, and she got what she honestly deserved. There's no malice in that statement, but she went after what was rightfully owed to her. So she dressed herself like a prostitute, and Judah didn't recognize her and said, "Hey, I'd like to sleep with you." And he didn't know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, "What will you give me so that, in payment for sleeping with me?" And he said, "I'll give you a young goat for my flock." And so she said, "Well, you don't have it with you, so what are you going to give to me as a pledge to prove that you'll actually come back and, give me the goat eventually?" So he said, "What pledge should I give you?" And she said, "Your signet and cord, so the thing that identifies you, and your staff that is in your hand." So the two things that identify him, basically. Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. So basically he gave her his ID. He gave her the signet, so when he would want to send a letter to somebody that was an important letter, he would need that signet to prove that it was him. It's like our signature. It's like, you know, our driver's license or our passport or anything like that, really. That was the weight and the value of this signet ring. He wasn't just giving her a ring. He was never planning to give her a ring. But no, it was actually a very, very valuable thing that would never leave his body apart. Yeah, like ever. So that and his staff, like all the men would just be walking around with a staff in their hand. And for him to take that out and give it to her was also like a big identifier of who he was. And it was just something awkward to not have with you. So he slept with her and she conceived, and then she got up and went in her merry way and put aside her veil that she'd been wearing to look like a prostitute and put back on her garments of widowhood. So she pretended like nothing happened. And then 3 months later, well, actually before that happens, Judah went and sent the young goat by the hand of his friend, Hero the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her, and he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is that harlot who was openly by the roadside?" And they said, "There was no harlot in this place. What are you talking about?" And so that's kind of embarrassing. This guy's walking around with a goat trying to find a prostitute, and they're like, "There's no prostitute. I don't know what you're on about." And so eventually Hero comes back and he says to Judah, "I can't find her." Also, the men said that she doesn't exist. And then Judah said, "Well, all right, well, let her take them for herself, like the signet and the staff, just so we don't be shamed by openly looking for her, because she's like trying to play a trick on us and trying to get people to think badly of me. Because I sent this young goat and you have not found her. Like, we don't want to be causing anyone to, like, don't want to make a spectacle of ourselves in the process." And it came to pass about 3 months later that Judah was told Tamar, your daughter-in-law, was playing the harlot, and she has now gotten a child by being a prostitute. So Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." So apparently in those days, that was something that he could rightfully demand, that somebody who was being a prostitute, that was under his household, he could demand her to be burned because of her immoral behavior. And nobody really had much of an issue with this. Must have been a pretty common sort of demand among those people who would actually make something like that. But Judah must have been in a pretty bad kind of way, emotionally, to just react like that. Like, you can have rules, but a lot of the time back in those days, not everyone like followed the rules and like the values. They would just like sweep it onto the rug and leave it be. Like even in the case of Joseph and Mary, like Joseph could have demanded basically the exact same thing, that Mary be stoned or burned or publicly shamed or whatever, but he decided, because he was a nice guy, he was just going to quietly divorce her, and then the angel told him not to, because, you know, she was carrying Jesus and it's all good, it's from God. So, but like people could have handled the situation better, but Judah was just in such a bad way that he just reacted, and he wanted to take out his vengeance on everyone and everything, and Tamar was the perfect opportunity, and so he called her to be publicly burned, and so the whole town would have turned up and watched the showdown. And so she comes out saying she sent the signet and the staff and said, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." So the guy that I slept with to have this baby, that I definitely do have, you heard correctly. Yeah, this signet and cord and staff belong to that guy. Who do they belong to? Father-in-law. And so when Judah saw them, and it was out in public and everyone saw them, everyone would have recognized that it was his. He had no choice but to acknowledge that it was his, and said publicly, "She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son, and he never knew her again." So he never spoke to her again, he never slept with her again at this point. So he was very publicly humbled in her presence by her actions, by his own actions. Like, it's not a good idea to go sleeping with a prostitute and then try to, like, kill that prostitute. especially, yeah, it was a very mixed up situation, but basically she tricked him, and she tricked him good, and he backed himself into a corner and just had to be humble and admit it and try not to go and be so horrible to people around him for a while. So, now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was when she was giving birth that one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread, a red piece of string, and bound it on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly, and she said, "How did you break through? This breach be upon you." Therefore his name was Perez, which means breach, or divided. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay, so that's the story. That's the whole of chapter 38, which I managed to drag out forever and ever. I have some notes that I'd like to read out. That's, yeah, I probably already touched on these points already, but anyway. Judah, his name, Judah means praise. And when I was just thinking about his name, I was like, Jesus, I praise you. So like seeing the connection already between Judah and Jesus, even though Judah was a really rough, horrible guy that we, like, how did he become the heir of the family fortune and the guy who managed to have the blessing come through him? Like, there's nothing good about him, right? Like, he eventually admits and becomes humbled, but he doesn't seem to enjoy the process. And that's like the last that we really hear of him for a bit. Like, we see him a little bit towards the end of Genesis, you know, interacting with Joseph and his family in that sense, but not to as much detail as in this chapter. So Judah is basically, he sucks quite a lot, at least at first. He was so done with everything. He was scared of Tamar. He was paranoid that she was cursed and all his sons would die just because of her. Instead, his lineage leading to Jesus came through her when he slept with her, thinking she was just a prostitute. He was scared. He was done. He was at his lowest point. He humiliated himself publicly, and God gave him a double blessing. Both sons he had lost were restored in the twins that Tamar bore. He received the birthright, which was the headship of the clan, leadership and honor. So basically, despite all the dumb stuff that he did and that he allowed in his family and all the curses that came upon his family, and like his two oldest sons died, in the end, in this whole mixed up horrible process, he ends up having those children restored to him. God is still giving him blessing and honor just because he chose him, just because he was the chosen one in the family. Like, it just kind of just happened that, you know, he ends up becoming the one who has the family blessing that will go on. And, you know, David is that king that comes from Judah's line. And then we see Jesus comes from Judah. Like, all of this stuff comes through him, and yet he was just a pretty horrible kind of guy. I have other words that I'd like to use, but then I'm not allowed to. So basically, yeah, he just stuffed up a whole bunch, and God had lots and lots of grace for him. And God has lots and lots of grace for us. Like, if you are finding yourself in a situation like Judah, where whether God has given you a promise directly or a promise for your family, or like, we know that God has a purpose and a plan for our lives. So you do have a promise on your life, whether God has told you directly what that is yet or not. And even if you haven't, God does have a plan for you. And he wants to redeem you from all of the dumb decisions that you've made in the past that have gotten you into such a bad place. If you find yourself depressed and lonely, or, you know, going to prostitutes, or, you know, pornography, or whatever it is that you're doing, you know, you're a murderer, or you're trying to sell your brother into slavery, like whatever it could be that is so horrible and that you're having to keep secret and hidden from people around you just to keep this image up, just give it to Jesus. Just lay it down at his feet and let him heal you. That brings me to this this poem that God gave me actually earlier this year. I think it's really beautiful. On the 2nd of January, I wrote this, 2nd of January 2021. Says, I am the God of the covenant. A covenant I chose, I initiated, I keep to this day. You are my bride, my Jacob, my Israel. And wherever you wander or stray, I will be with you. I love you with an everlasting love. No matter what you do or how far you run, I will find you and be with you and heal every bruise, every battered heart, every lonely soul. You are never alone. And so when God gave me this, it was pretty clear that as we read through, especially the Old Testament, that whenever God is speaking of Jacob or Israel, especially in the prophets, he's referring to his church, like we as Christians, anyone who follows and believes in him as a corporate group and also as individuals. God loves us and he calls us his Jacob, his Israel, his beloved one, his chosen people. And we see throughout the Old Testament especially this idea that God has made this covenant, which is like this marriage. It's like marriage is the closest thing that we can think of that is like the covenant that God has made with humans. It's the deepest commitment possible that God has chosen to make with us. Because of sin and his love for us, he wants to save us from the sin that we find ourselves in, that we've kind of caused ourselves. And he makes this promise that Jesus will come to put things right. And so that's the whole Old Testament, basically this whole setup of the story of this promise that God is going to send Jesus to die. And then the whole New Testament is like Jesus coming to die for us and fulfilling that promise and like sort of what all of that means from now on. And so the whole Bible is about this covenant, and it's all about God's love for humanity and how he makes promises and he keeps them. And it doesn't matter how much we screw up in the process, he's going to keep his promise, damn it. So even if it takes a little bit of striking some people dead in the meantime to get the plan into action, like, he's going to do it. He's going to rebuke the nation of Israel and send them into exile and have a whole bunch of them die. And he's going to have that kind of level of rebuke on us if he needs to as Christians today. Like, a lot of us are very wishy-washy Christians and we don't really take God seriously. But the more that I get to know God, the more serious of a relationship it can be. And I have been very well rebuked this year. Last year was not fun at all either. This year it's felt a lot gentler, where God's told me, hey, these are the issues in your life, but you know what? I'm not going to strike you dead. I'm going to love you through it. And no matter how tough it gets, no matter how far you try to run away from me in the process, I will be here with you no matter how dark, no matter the darkness and the despair and just all the feelings, which I get a lot of feelings, guys. And it can just be almost debilitating sometimes, but it doesn't matter. Through all of that, God is right there with me and he's right there with you. No matter how dark and despairing your life is right now, no matter how far you've tried to run away from God or what you've done that you think is so shameful, so sinful that God can't get you, he can get you, okay? He is in the heights in the heavens and he's in the depths of hell. No matter where you can think of in the universe, God can be right there with you, and he is there. He is so big, he is so full of love that Jesus died. He went to death for us, and he is right there with us when we think we're in death, when we think we're in the darkest part of our lives. So that's what I want you to just keep in your mind this week, is no matter how honestly terrible life gets, just turn to Jesus. He's right there with you. He says it so many times. Go and find the promises in the Bible that says that he will be with us, that he will be with you. Yeah, that's all. I love you guys. I'll see you again next week. See ya. Bye.